He thought he was just an ordinary man. Until one moment shattered everything he knew. A mysterious monk appears. A whisper from the soul stirs. A path opens, with no way back. Based on the true story of Acarya Krpananda Avadhuta, this is more than a story. It's a transformation. The path of no return, now streaming on the worker. The sky that night was uneasy, not with thunder, not with rain, but with a strange pressure, like something was about to begin. Above a quiet hostel tucked on the edge of rural Bihar, the stars blinked through a thick, humid haze. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead in the common room, its blades clicking with every revolution. It did nothing to ease the heat. Inside one of the small concrete rooms, a boy lay awake, his palms pressed flat against the woven mat beneath him. His name was Krishnendu, 16 years old, wiry thin, and restless not from the weather, but from a weight he couldn't name. Sleep had become a stranger to him lately. Outside the cracked window, stray dogs barked at passing shadows, and the occasional breeze rustled the neem leaves. But the boy's mind was far away, chasing echoes of ancient stories his mother used to whisper before she died. Why was Arjuna so lucky? He had once asked her. Why did the Lord appear to him, and not to someone like me? Her answer had come with a tired smile. Maybe he is waiting for you to ask the right question. She had passed a year later, and her words had stayed like footprints on wet earth. Since then, his guardians, older siblings hardened by life, had offered little more than chores and corrections. Yet there was something about him that even they couldn't mock. A fire, a focus. Something in his bones refused to settle for the life he was born into. Krishnendu sat up on the edge of the bed. His roommates murmured in their sleep, limbs tangled in sheets soaked with sweat. He pulled a thin towel around his shoulders and rose, stepping silently onto the corridor that opened to the eastern fields. The hostel was quiet at this hour, save for the groaning planks of the bamboo ceiling. In the distance, the first faint cry of a coal echoed across the treetops. It was the hour before dawn, the pause between dreams and duty. And in that pause, something moved. Not a sound, not a figure, but a certainty. A feeling in his chest, like the pulling of a tide. He didn't understand it, but he listened. He walked barefoot toward the edge of the compound, his feet brushing against warm dust and dry grass. The moon hung low and tired, casting long shadows that reached ahead of him as if to say, "Go on." In the silence before dawn, when the stars still shimmer like the last embers of a dying fire, a boy walked alone beneath the whispering trees of a sleeping village in Bihar. The year was 1962, and monsoon mist coiled low along the narrow footpaths, veiling everything in a hush that only the gods could understand. Bamboo thickets lined the trail like sentinels, wet from last night's rainfall. A breeze passed gently through them, as if clearing the way for something sacred. Krishnendu, barefoot, sandal in hand, orange cloth bag slung across his shoulder, moved like a shadow stitched into the earth. He was 16, barely tall enough to be noticed, yet he walked with a conviction most grown men never find in a lifetime. The early morning dew chilled his skin, but his heart was burning with something far deeper than weather. He wasn't heading to school, he wasn't running errands, he was chasing a whisper. And that whisper had a name, Sadhana. Just the day before, he had been told to return at 4 a.m. by a mysterious man cloaked in silence and mantra. No explanation, just a time. and a look in his eyes that said, "If you come, your life will never be the same again." So he came. As he reached the outskirts of the village, the night was still holding back the day. Smoke curled slowly from cow dung fires in distant huts, and somewhere in the distance, a conch shell cried out from a temple window, its sound thin but unmistakable, like a cosmic announcement only the awake could hear. Krishnendu stepped off the main path and turned down a lane that looked like it hadn't been walked in years. The dust clung to his feet like memory. He passed a sleeping cow, tied lazily under a tree, its breath fogging the morning air. His ears picked up the faintest murmur, a rhythmic cadence, like the beating of a drum deep inside the womb of the earth. Baba Nam Kevalam, Baba Nam Kevalam. It wasn't chanting. It was breathing. The boy stopped in front of a gate made of bamboo and wire. It was half open, swaying gently on a rusted hinge. He stepped through, and the world behind him seemed to vanish. Ahead, in a modest courtyard wrapped in banana leaves and woven jute, sat 5 men cross-legged under a thatched canopy. Their eyes were closed. Their faces glowed, not with light, but with presence. Clay oil lamps burned low around them, forming a circle of golden breath against the awakening sky. The mantra swelled and softened in waves. Krishnendu froze, feet rooted to the ground. He wasn't sure if he had found the right place, or if the place had found him. The pull in his chest was no longer silent. It throbbed like a drum. One of the men stirred, tall, with a long, mist-dampened beard and shoulder-length hair peeking from beneath his turban. His ochre robe shimmered with dew. He didn't look at Krishnendu. He saw him. "You came," he said, voice even, unblinking. "Good," the man added. A pause. Then he added, "But it's not time yet. Come back at 4. Krishnendu wanted to protest, to explain that it was already 4, but something in the man's voice silenced him, not by force, but by presence. He turned and walked away, back through the mist, past the trees, past the gate that didn't creak this time, into the soft edge of the village that had no idea a boy had just stepped through a threshold far more ancient than any door. At the edge of a well, carved in stone and worn smooth from generations, he sat down. Doubt pressed against him. Was this the right path? Would it lead anywhere at all? Had he misunderstood everything? The koel bird called from the trees, melancholic, hopeful. And in that strange hour between night and morning, Krishnendu didn't meditate. He didn't chant. He just waited, not with fear, but with reverence. He wasn't rushing forward anymore. He was allowing the moment to arrive. The wind shifted. The earth breathed, and with it, so did he. He would return, not because someone told him to, but because something inside had already decided. The ashram was unlike anything Krishnendu had ever known. It sat humbly at the edge of the village, shaded by neem and peepal trees, their long branches swaying like silent sentinels in the morning breeze. A soft red tint now colored the sky, and the first sunbeam fell on the orange dhotis, drying on a bamboo line, robes worn not by priests or teachers, but by monks whose eyes burned with something deeper. Krishnendu stood motionless at the open gate, his breath caught not by awe but by the strange rhythm of life that pulsed here, slow, deliberate, purposeful. A rooster crowed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a bucket thudded onto the earth. And yet, it was the silence between the sounds that pulled at him. Then, a presence. He didn't see him approach, only felt it. A monk, tall, wrapped in ochre, with long, coiled hair cascading over his shoulders and a beard trimmed close but full, stepped silently out from the shadows of the mango tree. His face was serene, but his gaze, it cut through time. The monk said nothing, he just looked, and in that gaze, something shattered. Krishnendu's legs almost buckled. It wasn't fear, it was exposure. The monk's eyes didn't merely see him, they knew him, as though every layer of thought, every longing, every secret had just been turned inside out and laid bare. Krishnendu tried to bow, but the gesture came too late. The monk had already turned and was walking away, without a word, toward the inner courtyard. Yet the boy followed, silently, instinctively. He no longer needed words. As they entered this inner courtyard, the morning light spilled across the earth like a divine spotlight. Several monks were gathered, some seated in meditation, some sweeping the ground, one chanting a mantra that floated like incense in the breeze, but none of them looked up. The ashram lived not on attention, but intention. The monk stopped near the well. Turning slightly, he spoke, not with his lips, but with his presence. "Your journey begins now," his eyes seemed to say. Krishnendu's heart thundered. Not in fear, not in excitement, in recognition. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't know the path ahead. But for the first time in his life, he knew where he belonged. The master had looked into him and silently said, "You were expected." And just like that, without ritual, without ceremony, the boy had stepped into the current of something eternal. The light had changed. It was no longer the hesitant glow of early dawn. Now it stretched confidently across the rooftops and courtyards of the village, brushing over worn mud walls and banana trees, painting the world in liquid gold. It was the kind of light that didn't just illuminate, it revealed. As Krishnendu stepped once more through the ashram gate, something inside him shifted. The simple courtyard was unchanged, ringed by earthen walls and shaded by a canopy of woven jute and dried banana leaves. Yet, in the new light, it no longer seemed ordinary. The circle of clay oil lamps still flickered faintly in defiance of the sun. The same young monks still sat cross-legged on straw mats. But now the air itself felt charged with presence. The chanting had deepened. Baba Nam Kevalam. Baba Nam Kevalam. It no longer sounded like human voices. It had become a living presence, pulsing, radiant, enveloping the entire courtyard. The mantra moved in waves, seeping into the cracks of the brick, weaving through the air and settling on Krishnendu's skin like sacred ash. He didn't hesitate. This time, he stepped forward without needing to be invited. A subtle shift passed through the circle. No words, no gestures. Yet a space opened effortlessly, welcoming, like a womb receiving its child. He walked toward it and sat down, folding his legs with quiet reverence, aligning his spine like the others, trying to still his breath. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange exhilaration, a whisper of destiny brushing his ears. The monk who had spoken to him earlier, the one whose eyes had seen through him like sunlight through water, opened his eyes once more. His gaze, calm and oceanic, met Krishnendu's only briefly before he leaned slightly forward and spoke, his voice low and steady. "Close your eyes," he said gently, "and listen, not to us, but to yourself." Krishnendu obeyed. The moment his eyelids lowered, the world behind them widened into vast darkness. Not empty, but alive, full of breath and silence. Outside, the chant continued, but now it felt less like sound and more like vibration. It thrummed through the soil beneath him, passed through his body like ripples on water, and settled between his ribs, in the small hidden places where language could not go. And then it came. Not a thought, not a voice, not even a feeling, just a knowing. This is what you were born for. The words didn't arrive in language. They bloomed inside him like a forgotten memory. His eyes stung. A single tear slid down his cheek, not from sorrow, not even from joy, but from the awe of being found. He didn't move. The sun rose higher, flooding the courtyard with brilliance, but inside, Krishnendu remained still, anchored in something vast and quiet and entirely new. The monks continued their mantra, their posture unchanged. Time had melted. The moment was complete. Krishnendu was no longer a boy seeking the path. He had already stepped into it. And the stillness, warm, luminous, eternal, welcomed him like a long-lost child returning home. The sun had now climbed well past the horizon, casting long shafts of light that stretched across the worn earthen courtyard. The soft morning breeze stirred gently through the banana leaves above, causing flickers of shadow to ripple across the bare ground like water stirred by breath. Krishnendu sat still, his back straight, his legs folded, and his breath moving in slow, even tides. Though his eyes were closed, a new clarity had settled behind them. There was no sense of time passing, no need to question where he was or why he had come. It was as though the earth itself had drawn him here, not with force, but with recognition. Around him the Dada sat motionless. Their beards, kissed with morning dew, shimmered faintly in the gold light. One of them, the same who had met him with calm certainty before, now leaned forward. His voice was soft, but each word felt weighted with something old and immense. "You've stepped into the path, brother," he said, his voice steady like a stone resting in a stream. "But every path has form, and form has guardians." He leaned down and with a single finger traced a circle in the dust in front of Krishnendu. The circle was small, simple, yet perfectly drawn, clean, without hesitation. Dust rose faintly in its wake before settling again like prayer. "Yama and Niyama," the monk said, his fingertip resting at the edge of the circle. "The first steps. These are not your burdens. They are your protection." Krishnendu watched, his brow furrowed slightly, not with resistance, but with reverence. Every word that followed sank into him like seeds into freshly turned soil. Ahimsa, non-harming in all you do, in thought, word, and action, even in silence. Satya, truth, not for pride, but to become clean. Asteya, stealing is not just of things, but time, energy, and trust. Brahmacharya, self-control, not abstinence, but sacred focus. Aparigraha, do not carry what is not yours to hold. The wind picked up gently, lifting a corner of the jute canopy above them. Light spilled across the circle of dust, now glowing in the sun. The Dada continued, drawing a second circle around the first with the same quiet precision. "These are the niyamas, daily offerings of the spirit. Shaucha, cleanliness in body, but also in motive. Santosha, contentment that doesn't numb the soul. Tapa, austerity not to punish, but to sharpen. Svadhyaya, study, yes, but also reflection, reading the self. And Ishvara Pranidhana, surrender, not defeat, but trust." Krishnendu's chest rose and fell, his breath slower now. The words weren't new, not exactly. But here, under the sun and in the presence of these men, they felt like revelations, not commands, but invitations, not barriers, but bridges. The monk stood and brushed his hands gently together, as if closing a quiet ceremony. Then he looked down at Krishnendu and said, "These principles, they're not the path. They are what keep you on it when your feet falter." From beyond the ashram wall came the distant jangle of a cycle bell, a woman's voice calling to her son, the rustle of goats being led out to graze. Life was beginning again, but here, inside the quiet perimeter of that drawn circle, something ancient had already been set into motion. Krishnendu reached forward and placed his hand gently in the dust, right where the two circles met. The warmth of the earth beneath his palm told him what words never could. This was not the end of his search. This was the beginning of a vow. The morning had blossomed by the time Krishnendu left the courtyard. The sun, now fully awake, cast its golden warmth over the village, stirring life into every corner. Roosters crowed defiantly from rooftops, women swept courtyards with brisk strokes, and the clang of distant pots echoed like a metallic heartbeat of the waking day. Krishnendu walked with brisk steps, his sandals now strapped onto his feet, the cool sensation of morning dew clinging to the soles already fading with the sun's ascent. The world around him was no longer shrouded in mystery. It was vibrant, buzzing, and real. But inside him, something had shifted. He no longer felt like a boy wandering in search of something. He felt like someone returning from a sacred mission. He turned a corner and the school gate came into view. His heart sank for a brief moment. The large iron gates, painted once in blue but now peeling and rusted at the edges, stood partially open. Beyond them, the schoolyard was empty. His chest tightened. He was late. He began to jog. But just as he passed through the gate, something strange happened. There, standing beside the main entrance of the school building, was the old janitor, Suresh, a hunched man with a limp and a perpetually sleepy gaze. He stood motionless, one hand holding the rope that rang the school bell. He looked at Krishnendu, his brows raised in mild surprise. "Oh, you're early today," he muttered, blinking as if trying to convince himself he wasn't dreaming. Krishnendu froze. "Early?" "Yes," Suresh said, squinting at the sky. "Misplaced the gate keys this morning. Been searching for them since daybreak. Just found them now." He pulled the rope and the heavy school bell groaned into motion. The sound reverberated through the empty campus, bouncing off walls, bouncing off time itself. Krishnendu stood still, stunned. His Acharya's words returned to him with soft clarity. "You won't be late. Everything will be all right." He looked up at the bell, its swinging form shimmering in the morning sun. Around him, classmates began to trickle in, surprised by the delay, laughing and jostling their way through the gates as if the universe itself had hit a pause button just for them. But Krishnendu didn't laugh. He only smiled, quietly, inwardly, as though he had just seen behind the curtain of the ordinary and glimpsed the machinery of grace itself. In that moment, he realized something vital. There are no coincidences when the path is walked with sincerity. Even the bell had waited for him. The house was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that sits heavily, like an old shawl draped across the shoulders of the day. Outside, the wind shifted sluggishly through banana leaves, carrying the scent of boiled rice and tamarind from nearby homes. The corrugated tin roof crackled softly in the sun. Shadows of flying kites passed briefly over the courtyard as village boys played somewhere beyond the walls. Inside the kitchen, a square, mud-floored room with soot-darkened walls, Krishnendu stood barefoot near the threshold. The air smelled of cumin and mustard seeds sputtering in oil, and a pot of lentils simmered over a slow, smoky flame. His sister-in-law, a stocky woman with silver streaks in her braid and kindness tucked behind stern brows, ladled food into a metal plate with practiced rhythm. She didn't look up. "Did you meditate?" she asked. The question came like a lightning flash, soft, unexpected, yet splitting the air. Krishnendu blinked. "No, not yet," he said quietly, unsure if she had meant it seriously. She paused, wiped her hands on the edge of her sari, and turned to face him. Her eyes, normally unreadable, carried something ancient in that moment. Not rebuke, not authority, but stillness. "Then eat after meditation," she said simply, and returned to the stove. He stood there, stunned, not at the words, but at their weight. This was a woman who had never studied scriptures, who couldn't read or write. A woman who had never attended a dharma chakra or heard a discourse. And yet, her words echoed with the unmistakable ring of divine timing, sharp, precise, exact. Krishnendu stepped back from the kitchen, feeling the clay floor cool beneath his feet. Something was happening. The universe, through unexpected voices and unseen turns, was shaping him. Not just in the glow of chanting monks, but in kitchens filled with steam, in doorways of silence, in the voices of women too often overlooked. He went to his room, sat cross-legged on the mat, and closed his eyes. The chant came, not from his lips, but from inside. Baba Nam Kevalam. As his breath slowed and his spine straightened, he saw clearly. This path he had stepped into. It would not be lit only by gurus and monks. It would also be lit by mothers, by farmers, by janitors, by every unexpected lamp the divine would choose to ignite. The first light of morning had crept into the village like a whisper, soft, golden, reverent. It spilled across the mud walls and thatched roofs, illuminating everything with a glow that seemed to emerge from within the earth itself. The mist still clung to the roots of the bamboo groves, curling and lifting like incense smoke. Cows stirred behind stick fences. A rooster crowed, its cry slicing through the hush like the first note of a raga. Krishnendu walked slowly. His bare feet pressed gently into the cool, damp earth. Each step left a faint print on the village path as he made his way back toward the courtyard. The circle of chanting still pulsed in his memory like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. The words hadn't left his ears. Baba Nam Kevalam. Baba Nam Kevalam. He passed a woman sweeping the front of her hut with a bundle of twigs. Her eyes caught him for a moment. This young boy walking with such stillness, as though he was carrying something fragile inside. The world was waking up. But Krishnendu, he was waking into something else entirely. His mind still swirled with questions. Why had they sent him away? What did they mean by "not yet"? Why had the monk spoken without emotion yet left him trembling inside? Still there was no resentment, only readiness. He had waited, not out of obligation, but from something deeper, a longing that didn't explain itself. The little gate of the courtyard appeared once again, woven jute and drooping banana leaves framing its entrance. It looked unchanged, but he had changed. The space was the same, yet it felt completely different, as if he could finally see it for what it was. Not a courtyard, but a portal. He stepped in. The lamps were still burning, defiant against the sun's rising rays. The monks, silent, serene, still sat in their circle, unmoved by time. But as Krishnendu crossed the threshold, something invisible shifted. A space opened in the circle. No words, no signals, just a subtle invitation. He walked toward it. He sat. And for the first time in his life, his body aligned with something far greater than posture. His spine straightened, but it was his spirit that stood tall. The monk who had spoken to him earlier opened his eyes. This time, his gaze was softer, like moonlight on still water. He leaned forward, his beard catching a glint of sunlight, and spoke quietly. "Close your eyes," he said, "and listen, not to us, but to yourself." Krishnendu obeyed, and the world, as he had known it, disappeared. The morning had fully arrived, but in that courtyard, time moved differently. The sun had risen above the banana groves now, spilling through the frayed canopy and gilding everything in soft amber light. The oil lamps were still burning, though their glow seemed modest beside the blazing sky. No one moved to put them out. They weren't there to push back the darkness. They were there to honor it, to welcome it, to remember that even light must be earned. Krishnendu sat cross-legged on the straw mat now, his body still, his heart racing. He had not been asked to speak. He had not been asked to explain himself. But a space had been made for him, unspoken, but unmistakable. The other monks sat with spines straight, eyes gently closed, breathing as one. Their orange robes rippled slightly in the breeze, like silent flames caught between inhale and exhale. A sound rose up again, gentle and deep. Baba Nam Kevalam. Not chanted, not sung. It pulsed. It moved like breath through lungs that had long forgotten separation. The mantra filled the space between thoughts, and then seeped through the cracks in Krishnendu's mind. He closed his eyes. The world dissolved, not in chaos, but in clarity. There were no temples, no scriptures, no questions. There was only breath, sound, silence. And somewhere within that silence came a whisper. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't language. It was knowing. This is what you were born for. The words didn't form in his mind. They unfurled from the marrow of his bones, ancient, sacred, already known. A single tear slipped down his cheek, surprising even himself. Not from sadness, not from joy, but from the staggering weight of homecoming. He hadn't found something new. He had remembered something old. The monk beside him, a tall Dada with uncut shoulder-length hair and a beard beginning to streak with silver, opened his eyes and leaned closer, his voice just enough to reach Krishnendu without disturbing the sacred current around them. "Close your eyes deeper," he whispered. "Not to shut the world out, but to let the truth in." Krishnendu breathed in. His lungs filled with incense and dust and light, and he obeyed. The chant flowed around him, unbroken. But now it wasn't external. It vibrated in his ribs. It beat inside his chest. The mantra wasn't being recited anymore. It was remembering itself, through him. Baba Nam Kevalam. Love is all there is. As the sun broke clean over the horizon, flooding the courtyard with dazzling gold, the world seemed to vanish, washed away in radiance. The young monks, the oil lamps, the faded bricks, the worn jute canopy, everything dissolved into one shimmering field of silence and sound. And there, in the center of it all, sat a boy who had crossed the invisible line between wondering and knowing. The courtyard, now fully awakened by the day's golden breath, felt like it had exhaled centuries of silence. Shadows retreated, curling along the mud walls, and the flickering lamps, once sovereign in the dimness, now burned humbly against the radiant sun. Krishnendu sat quietly, his legs folded, his eyes still moist from the whisper that had changed something deep within. His breath was slow, his heart steady. Around him, the monks continued their quiet practice, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just meditation now, it was communion. From the side of the courtyard, a bearded monk in full orange robes stood and brushed his hands together, not as a dismissal, but as if concluding a sacred ceremony only he could see. His long hair, tucked loosely behind his shoulders, shimmered faintly in the morning light. He stepped forward with a gentle firmness and looked at Krishnendu, not inspecting, not judging, just seeing, as though the young seeker before him had stepped out of a vision long awaited. "You've stepped into the path, Krishnendu," he said softly, kneeling beside him in the dust. "And every path has form, and form has companions." With a stick, he drew a wide circle in the courtyard dust. The monks looked on in silence. Krishnendu leaned forward, watching every motion. "Yama and Niyama," the monk continued, his voice like the flow of a river, patient, persistent, ancient. "These are not rules. These are guardians, ropes across a bridge. Without them, the winds will carry you away." He tapped the earth inside the circle with his finger. "Ahimsa, do not harm even in thought. Satya, speak the truth, especially when it trembles on your lips. Asteya, do not steal, not time, not trust, not even a glance that isn't yours. Brahmacharya, conserve your essence, your sacred current. Aparigraha, take only what life offers freely." He paused, watching Krishnendu's eyes widen, not in fear, but in realization. "Now the niyamas," the monk said, drawing smaller markings around the edge of the circle. "Shaucha, purify not just your body but your motives. Santosha, be content, not complacent. Tapa, let the friction of struggle refine you. Svadhyaya, study the self, for there you'll find the map. And Ishvara Pranidhana, surrender to the infinite, for he is the river, the boat, and the tide." Krishnendu bowed his head, as if each word was water trickling over him. From the nearby lane, a bell rang. A milkman passed, his cycle creaking along the village path. A rooster crowed, loud and clear, and from a hut nearby, a child's laughter cracked the stillness. But here, in this sacred courtyard, under the open sky of Bihar, only one sound mattered, the silent vow forming in Krishnendu's chest. The monk stood and smiled, the way a gardener might at the sight of a sprouting seed. "You have a long road ahead, Krishnendu, but now you do not walk alone." The morning breeze had shifted again. It now carried the scent of turmeric and smoldering coal fires from distant village hearths, mingling with the fading fragrance of sandalwood that still lingered in Krishnendu's nostrils from the courtyard's morning meditation. He walked slowly along a winding footpath that curled like a river through the quiet lanes of Jamalpur. His bare feet made soft impressions on the warm dust, still damp in places from last night's rain. With every step, it felt as though the earth was exhaling stories beneath him, as if even the soil remembered sacred footsteps from ages past. His mind buzzed with questions, but not of doubt. They were questions born of hunger, for truth, for clarity, for something greater than words. He had sat with the monks. He had chanted the mantra. He had seen the circle drawn in dust. But there was one question still unanswered, one whisper that hadn't yet found its voice. As he approached the edge of the village, the houses became fewer and the trees more abundant. A mango grove stood silent in the morning light, its branches heavy with green fruit, leaves dancing gently in the wind. Beneath one of the trees sat an older man on a stone bench, his robe unmistakably orange, his beard like a cascade of silver threads. It was the same Dada who had spoken to him earlier in the courtyard. He didn't call out to Krishnendu. He didn't beckon him closer. But his eyes, they were already waiting. Krishnendu approached cautiously, not out of fear, but reverence. The air around the monk felt hushed, as if sound itself knew to bow before him. Without a word, the Dada gestured to the spot beside him. Krishnendu sat, cross-legged. A moment passed, then another. The sounds of the village faded into the background, the distant rhythm of hand pumps, the bark of a dog, the faint clink of a chai vendor's glasses. Then the monk spoke, not in sermon, not in instruction, but in a tone so low it felt like the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. "Everything you need," he said slowly, "is already awake inside you. The mantra simply calls it out." Krishnendu glanced down, unsure how to respond. The monk continued. "You will hear many things on this path. Some will be wise, others just noise. But the true voice, the one that leads you home, will not shout. It will whisper." The boy looked up, eyes wide. "How will I know the difference?" he asked softly. The monk smiled, not with his mouth, but with the whole of his being. "Because it will be the only voice that waits for you, without chasing you." Krishnendu looked out across the grove. A single leaf detached from its branch, twirling in slow spirals through the air before touching down on the path before them. He understood. It was not always the loudest voice that held truth. It was the voice that waited, patiently, endlessly, lovingly. The voice of one's own soul. The monk stood, brushing the dust from his robe, and turned to leave. But just before stepping into the trees, he paused and said, "Come tomorrow. Before sunrise, bring nothing but silence." And just like that, he vanished into the orchard, leaving Krishnendu alone under the mango tree, heart brimming, not with answers, but with the soft, sacred echo of a whisper that would never leave him again. The air was crisper now, and the faint heat of dawn had dissolved into the rising pulse of village life. The sky was fully awake, brilliant and cloudless, casting sharp golden light across the school's dusty courtyard. Shadows of neem trees reached long across the ground, as if attempting to point the way. Krishnendu moved briskly toward the old school gate, his heart still echoing with the sound of mantra and the monk's whisper from earlier. Everything around him looked the same: mud brick walls, peeling posters on the notice board, faded paint, but inside him, something had changed. He wasn't just returning to school, he was returning with a vow smoldering quietly within. The school bell had not yet rung. The janitor, an older man with a stooped back and wise eyes hidden behind thick glasses, stood near the archway, staring at the great iron bell that hung beneath the wooden overhang. The bell looked ancient, almost sacred, like a relic from a forgotten temple. Its rope hung still, unmoved. Krishnendu approached him and bowed slightly. The janitor offered a tired smile and gestured at the bell. "Strange morning," he muttered. "It doesn't want to ring today." Krishnendu tilted his head, curious. Why not? The old man didn't answer right away. He just looked at the boy, then at the bell, then at the sky. "Some days," he finally said, "the world waits for something to happen first, before time moves forward." Without another word, he grasped the frayed rope and gave it a strong pull. Nothing. Not a single chime. He tried again. The bell moved, but no sound came. Krishnendu stared at the scene, something tightening in his chest. It felt like more than just a malfunction. It felt like a message, a pause, a question waiting to be answered. The janitor gave up with a sigh and turned away, leaving the bell swinging gently in the breeze. Then Krishnendu stepped forward. He didn't touch the rope. He simply stood beneath the bell, looking up into its dark hollow. He closed his eyes. Baba Nam Kevalam. Baba Nam Kevalam. He didn't chant it aloud. He repeated it silently, like a secret prayer wrapped in the breath of his soul. The breeze shifted. And then, softly at first, then louder, the bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. A deep, resonant tone rolled across the courtyard like a wave echoing into the morning sky. The students who had been gathering at the far end of the schoolyard turned in surprise. Some shielded their eyes to look toward the bell tower. The janitor, halfway down the corridor, froze mid-step and turned. Krishnendu opened his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just walked forward into the school building as if the ringing had always been part of the plan. And behind him, the bell swung again, singing once more with that slow, holy chime. The fields beyond the village stretched like a living canvas, brushed with golden stalks of ripened paddy, broken only by groves of palmyra and the still silhouettes of distant haystacks. It was just past mid-morning, and the earth radiated the warmth of the rising sun, steaming faintly where early dew still clung to the soil. Krishnendu moved slowly along a winding path that curved past the final row of huts. He carried a small cloth bag over his shoulder, a locket of Baba's image pressed between his fingers. His face was flushed with the inner tide of all he had just experienced. But this walk wasn't about joy. It was about anchoring something sacred before it vanished. He had been asked to go for a simple task, collect herbs, they said. A small errand that gave him a moment alone after the overwhelming silence of initiation. But every step through that golden light felt preordained. Halfway across the field, Krishnendu paused near a large, flattened mound, bare, cracked earth surrounded by unusually thick grass. An old neem tree leaned nearby, its branches reaching like bent arms over the space. A few villagers walked around it with unspoken reverence. An elderly farmer passing by saw Krishnendu's curious gaze and murmured, "That's the tiger's grave." Krishnendu turned to him, eyes wide. "Tiger?" The farmer nodded. "A long time ago there was a man-eater here. Took lives, until it was hunted down by a sadhu, they say. No one dares build or till here. Some things must be left in peace." Krishnendu stood silently as the man walked on, the sound of his wooden slippers fading into the hush of wind through the stalks. The boy stepped closer. There was no marker, no inscription, just earth and the weight of a story left behind. He folded his legs and sat beside the grave, placing his palms down on the warm soil. The field was quiet now. Only the rhythmic chirping of distant birds and the breeze dancing through the crops remained. He closed his eyes, letting the stillness deepen around him. He had been told about meditation, but here, beside a resting place of primal violence and divine courage, something shifted. He saw how light and darkness weren't enemies but partners. Even this earth had devoured death and now fed life. A whisper rose inside him. Not words, but awareness. One day, you will have to walk toward the tiger. His breath caught. Then, peace. He stayed a while longer, as though receiving lessons without language, preparing his soul for the path ahead. As he stood to leave, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. That field, that grave, that whisper, he would carry him forward. The midday sun bore down mercilessly, casting a shimmering glaze across the paddy fields. The village had slipped into its noonday hush, a silence that belonged not to peace, but to waiting. Cicadas shrilled from the treetops. The air was dry and electric, filled with the scent of parched soil, hay dust, and something ancient lingering like the memory of rain. Krishnendu sat cross-legged in the shade of the neem tree by the tiger's grave, The same place where the old man had once told him stories of spirits and saints, of warriors and ascetics who once walked this very soil. But this time, he was not there for stories. He had come for silence, for guidance, for something he couldn't name but felt stirring just beneath the surface of his breath. The earth beneath him was hot, cracked, and dusty. He dug a finger absent-mindedly into the soil, as if trying to trace something invisible. His cloth bag lay beside him, untouched. In his other hand he held a smooth stone, a river-washed oval, no bigger than his palm. It was not special by any worldly measure, but it had weight. It felt like something Baba might ask him to hold. He ran his fingers across its curved edges again and again until his thoughts began to still. Time melted, even the cicadas seemed to hush. It was then that it happened. From nowhere, yet from everywhere, he heard it. A voice. Not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. "Are you ready to walk where others hesitate?" The words were not a question. They were a breath, a knowing, a ripple through the very field of existence. Krishnendu gripped the stone tighter, heart pounding. He looked around. The field was empty. Only the neem tree watched him. Only the wind listened. He pressed the stone to his chest. He closed his eyes. In that moment, the entire weight of his past, his family, his school, his village identity, seemed to lift and scatter like chaff on the wind. He whispered, not aloud, but inwardly. "Yes, I'm ready." The stone grew warm in his palm. Not hot, just warm enough to tell him that something had changed. In the distance, a bell rang, from the school perhaps, or the temple. He didn't know which, but it felt like the echo of destiny, calling him back into motion. He stood, dusted off his knees, and tucked the stone into his bag. He would carry it, not for luck, but as a reminder. A symbol of the vow made in silence beneath the neem tree, beside the grave of a tiger and 1,000 unspoken stories. He turned toward the village path. The sun was beginning to dip westward. His feet moved not just with purpose, but with promise. Something had begun. Something he could no longer turn away from. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the village fields. A dusty wind stirred the dry stalks, carrying with it the scent of ripening grain and distant cooking fires. It was that golden hour when the world softens, and even time seems to pause to catch its breath. Krishnendu stood at the edge of the tiger's grave, the calling stone still warm in his palm. He had held it for hours now, as if it were an anchor between his questions and whatever force had begun answering them. The whispers of the morning, those deep inward truths that had stirred in meditation, had not left him. They were alive still, echoing quietly through his heart. But now another question pressed in. What next? Across the fields, a figure emerged through the dust. A tall man in ochre robes, walking with long, steady strides. His beard fluttered in the wind, his uncut hair tied back beneath a saffron turban. In his eyes shimmered the depth of rivers that had seen many banks, many floods, and still flowed steady. Krishnendu recognized him. It was the same monk who had spoken to him at dawn in the courtyard, the one who had guided him into silence and told him to listen. The monk approached without urgency. He stopped beside Krishnendu and gazed at the stone in his hand. "You heard it, didn't you?" the monk asked, his voice as calm as the evening breeze. Krishnendu nodded. The monk looked out across the field. "This place," he said, "was once feared. Even grown men wouldn't pass near after sundown. But you came, not because you were brave, but because you were willing to listen." Krishnendu looked up. "Why here?" The monk's eyes softened. "Because silence grows strong in forgotten places, and when fear no longer grows there, courage begins to take root." There was a pause, the kind that lets truth settle. Baba often says, the monk continued, that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to act with love despite fear. You took that step today. That's why you're still holding that stone. It answered you. Krishnendu turned the stone slowly in his hand, now aware that it wasn't just a stone anymore. It was a symbol. A memory of a moment when something sacred passed between silence and the soul. What happens now? He asked. The monk smiled slightly, his eyes crinkling. Now you choose whether to carry that courage with you, or leave it here, buried like the tiger. As the wind kicked up a wave of dust behind them, Krishnendu rose, slipping the stone into a fold of his cloth bag. He didn't answer with words. He simply began walking, following the monk along the same path back, his stride steadier now, his heart a little fuller. The tiger's grave lay behind them once more, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt blessed. The wind had begun to shift. It wasn't fierce, just insistent, as if carrying news from somewhere unseen. The fields were quiet, the shadows long, and Krishnendu's feet traced a slow, steady path behind the monk who walked ahead, robes rustling like whispered mantras. They didn't speak. After the bell had been rung, after the courtyard silence had swallowed his name, after the field and the tiger's grave, Krishnendu followed. There was no instruction, no formal invitation, but it was clear. He was being led somewhere that mattered. The village faded behind them, its scattered homes now silhouettes in the fading light. They crossed a broken bridge, its bamboo rails tied with fraying rope, and walked beneath groves of neem and tamarind trees. With each step, Krishnendu felt the hush deepen inside him. Not fear, not even reverence now. It was like walking inside the breath of something ancient. They reached a narrow road flanked by fields on one side and a row of banyan trees on the other. In the distance, cows lowed. The scent of earth, sweet and damp, rose with the twilight mist. The monk stopped, turned. "This is where I leave you," he said softly. Krishnendu blinked, confused. "But where do I go?" The monk didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached down and drew a faint line across the dust with his sandal. "There are two paths from here," he said. "One will return you to the life you know. It's full of names and duties and dreams others dreamed for you." He paused. "The other is narrow, winding. You'll often walk it alone, sometimes barefoot, often unnoticed. But if you stay with it long enough, if you walk it fully, it will carry you beyond everything." Krishnendu stared at the line. It was almost invisible, just a gentle break in the dust, a whisper of choice. Then the monk's voice dropped lower, like the rustle of leaves at dusk. "Do not look for signs. Do not wait for someone to say, 'Now you're ready.' The path doesn't open with permission. It opens when you begin walking." And then, like so many moments that had come before, the monk turned and walked away, his form fading into the veil of blue dusk and banyan roots. Krishnendu stood alone. In front of him, the air was thick with the scent of hibiscus. A lone firefly danced above the dust line. Somewhere behind, a dog barked and was answered by another, farther off. The weight of the day pressed on his shoulders, but in a way that felt grounding, not burdensome. He looked down. The dust. The line. The two paths. His chest tightened, not in fear, but in that aching way the soul feels when it recognizes a moment that can't be undone. The sky had turned a deep indigo. The last traces of daylight surrendered to the hush of night. The air no longer shimmered with golden mist. Now it was thick with silence, the kind that feels like velvet pressed against the skin. Every sound was amplified in its stillness, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the rhythmic chorus of crickets calling out across the fields. Krishnendu sat alone beneath the open sky, cross-legged on a straw mat in a field just beyond the edge of the village. The very earth beneath him seemed to hold its breath. Overhead, the stars had begun to pierce through the darkness one by one, slowly illuminating the sky like the patient lighting of ceremonial lamps in an unseen temple. His hands rested gently on his knees, his breath soft and steady. He had returned from the field with Dada earlier that evening, heart and mind swirling with images from the day, rituals that were not rituals, teachings that wrapped around his soul like ancient vines, and that peculiar moment with the stone that had whispered something sacred into his chest. Now he waited, not for a sign nor a miracle. He was waiting for the silence to speak. He had been told not to expect visions, not to chase experiences, just to sit, to breathe, to remember the mantra, not as a chant, but as a vibration, a feeling, a current that moves beneath thought, beneath personality, beneath even identity. So he did. Baba Nam Kevalam. The words did not come from his lips. They stirred like wind through the hollow of his chest, echoing within his ribs, rolling through his spine. The mantra wasn't being repeated. It was remembering itself through him. A gust of wind swept gently across the field, carrying the scent of neem trees and damp grass. Somewhere far off, a jackal howled, a long, mournful cry that seemed to call out across lifetimes. And then, silence. A deeper silence than before. The kind of silence that holds presence. A living stillness. Krishnendu didn't know how long he sat there. Time folded in on itself. His body softened. His thoughts dissolved. It wasn't sleep. It wasn't dreaming. It was being. Then, from behind him, the faint sound of footsteps on the dry earth. Slow, purposeful. He opened his eyes, not startled, but aware. Turning slightly, he saw Dada standing in the dim moonlight, his silhouette wrapped in saffron robes, his beard moving softly with the breeze. "You stayed," Dada said quietly. Krishnendu nodded. "You listened." "I tried," Krishnendu replied. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone half submerged in water. Dada came closer and sat beside him without a word. For a while, they both stared at the sky, where constellations now shimmered like ancient stories carved in starlight. Finally, Dada spoke. "There are many nights ahead like this. Each one will ask something different of you. But remember, don't try to hold the experience. Let it pass through you. The divine doesn't want to be caught. It wants to move with you." Krishnendu nodded again, a quiet understanding blooming inside. And so they sat, two seekers, one barely beginning, the other walking far ahead, yet side by side beneath the eternal dome of the cosmos. The night stretched out before them like a sacred scroll yet to be written. And somewhere deep in the heart of the silence, the mantra pulsed like a heartbeat. Baba Nam Kevalam. Baba Nam Kevalam. Baba Nam Kevalam. The rains had not yet broken, but the sky carried the weight of a coming storm. The wind moved in slow, deliberate gusts, rustling the tall grass like whispers from forgotten voices. Beneath that bruised sky, the earth was cracked, thirsty, and waiting. Krishnendu followed the senior monk, Dada Kailash, through the narrow alleys of the village, their bare feet slapping the dirt path softened by the breath of humidity. The boy's mind was quiet now, not because he had no questions, but because something deeper had begun to bloom in his chest, a kind of listening. Dada Kailash walked with the kind of certainty that made the world seem organized around his steps. They passed low houses with mud-plastered walls and children peeking through bamboo fences. A dog barked once and then fell silent. The village seemed to know something sacred was passing through it. They reached the edge of the field where the path broke into the forest. Before them stood a lone sal tree, its trunk scarred by time and ritual. Beneath it, embedded in the soil like a buried heartbeat, was a large, flat stone. "This is the place," Dada Kailash said softly. Krishnendu looked at the stone. It didn't look special, just a moss-covered slab, slightly sunken in the ground. But as he stepped closer, he felt it. A pulse in the air, a kind of spiritual gravity. "This is where Baba once sat," the monk continued. "During a storm, years ago. People said a tiger had been prowling these parts. Some were afraid to come out at night." He gestured to the sky. That night, the clouds were black, angry. Lightning danced on the ridges like celestial swords. People begged Baba to avoid the field. Krishnendu lowered himself beside the stone, folding his legs, placing his hands on his knees. The stone was cool, even in the thick air. His body instinctively moved into a meditative position, not out of discipline, but as if the land itself was asking him to sit. "But Baba came and said otherwise," Dada Kailash said, his voice gentler now, almost a whisper. "He sat right here, just like this, and said the tiger's spirit had never hunted out of malice. He said, it guarded this place." Krishnendu turned toward him, eyes wide. Dada Kailash continued, "Some say the tiger's body was buried beneath this stone. That Baba came during its cremation and meditated through the storm to release its lingering samskara." The wind stirred again, sending a few leaves tumbling from the tree above. A distant rumble of thunder pressed its voice against the horizon. "Not all things that seem fierce are your enemies," Dada Kailash said. "Sometimes they are just waiting to be freed." Krishnendu touched the stone gently with his fingertips. It felt warm now, alive even, as if it remembered. His breath slowed. The sky above him was heavy with a storm, but he felt no fear. Only a deep stillness. And in that stillness, something flickered inside him. Not an image, not a word, but a sensation. As if the fire of that night still burned somewhere, lighting a path he hadn't known he was walking. The rain came not with fury, but with stillness. Soft, steady sheets of water falling from a quiet sky, like the tears of a land long waiting. The sun had disappeared behind charcoal clouds, and the trees bowed gently, their leaves dripping with silver. In the hush of this gentle downpour, the world seemed to hold its breath. Krishnendu sat beneath the thatched awning of a modest shelter just off the footpath, his clothes damp, his skin cooled by the earth's sighing exhale. Next to him sat Dada Kailash, his ochre robe darkened at the shoulders, his long hair now tied back beneath a simple cotton cloth. The older monk's face was calm, eyes resting on the droplets dancing along the edges of banana leaves. The silence between them was deep, but not empty. Krishnendu had not spoken since they left the tiger's grave. Something inside him was stirring, but the words hadn't caught up yet. He glanced sideways at the Dada, half expecting him to speak some esoteric truth about fear, death, or spirit. But Dada Kailash only watched the rain. Finally, it was the boy who broke the stillness. "Dada," he said, his voice barely above the rhythm of the rain. "What was that place? Why did we go there?" Dada Kailash didn't answer immediately. Instead, he extended a hand into the rain, let a few drops fall into his palm, then said quietly, "Sometimes, when a tree is struck by lightning, the scar it leaves makes the trunk grow stronger. Krishnendu blinked. The meaning hovered above him like the clouds, there, but not yet raining down. You think that stone was just a grave? Dada Kailash asked, glancing at him now. That stone holds the memory of choice. Once, many years ago, something wild died there, and with it, a part of someone's fear. Krishnendu was silent again, but his breath had deepened. Dada continued. Baba brought me there. I asked him why he chose that place. He said, every soul has its grave, and every grave its lesson. Some we bury, some we sit beside until the sky changes. The wind stirred a hanging cloth nearby, and the scent of the wet earth curled between them like incense. The world around them was so alive, yet softened, gentle, listening. Dada Kailash looked out at the path again. Krishnendu, don't chase understanding. Let it arrive like this rain, soft, unavoidable, and never quite where or when you expect it. The boy felt something shift inside him, like the tight knot he had carried since his awakening had been loosened by invisible hands. Then Dada said, almost as if to the rain itself, this is why Baba sends us to places others fear, because the soul that walks through shadow learns to carry light. They sat together, unmoving, as the rain bathed the land and the path before them began to glisten with new life. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. A peacock cried out from the shelter of a banyan tree, and beneath the falling sky, two seekers sat, not as teacher and student, but as two souls receiving the same unseen lesson. The sun dipped low across the plains of Bihar, pouring its final gold over the land like a blessing too large for words. Krishnendu stood silently by the edge of the old courtyard, a small cloth bundle at his feet, the sum total of all he owned in this world. Around him, the ashram pulsed with a quiet kind of celebration. There were no fireworks, no parades, only the soft, solemn presence of monks and devotees who knew that a new chapter was opening, not with fanfare, but with the sure, strong beat of surrender. The elder monk, the one who had first welcomed him into this circle of stillness months ago, approached, his ochre robes stirring in the evening breeze. His beard, touched lightly with silver, framed a face that had seen many such crossings. He placed a hand on Krishnendu's shoulder, firm, steady, and warm. You have crossed the first threshold, he said. His voice carried both kindness and gravity. But now, the real journey begins. Krishnendu nodded, swallowing the tightness in his throat. The elder pointed down a narrow path leading out of the village, lined with dust and the fragrance of distant jasmine. You are being sent to the training center, he said. It is there you will be shaped, not by comfort but by fire. You will study, you will serve, you will fall and rise again. Only then, when the time is right, will you wear these robes as your own. The words struck deep, not as a burden but as a promise. Krishnendu bent to lift his small bundle. The fabric was rough beneath his fingers, but he clutched it like a sacred offering. The first steps away from the ashram felt like stepping into open sky. There was fear, yes, but it was the fear that tastes like freedom. As he walked away, the lamps along the ashram walls flickered in the wind, each flame bowing low as if whispering a blessing behind him. The path twisted into shadow, then into light again. There was no turning back now. Not for Krishnendu. Not for the life he was stepping toward. The path ahead was narrow, steep, and unseen, but it was his path. And with silent courage, he placed one foot before the other into the vast waiting arms of destiny. There are journeys we take with luggage, and there are journeys we take with vows. What you have just witnessed was not the story of a boy becoming a monk. It was the awakening of something ancient within the soul of a seeker. Krishnendu did not choose this path out of rebellion. He was called, not by words, but by silence, by storms, by stones, by eyes that saw beyond his fear. And when he stepped forward, onto dust, into dusk, through the sacred circle, past the whispering bell, he did not walk alone. He walked with every soul that has ever asked, "Is there more to life than this?" This was only the beginning. What lies ahead are fire and discipline, service and surrender, mystery and transformation. But the decision has been made. There is no returning, only deepening, only remembering, only walking further into the arms of the infinite. The path is narrow, the sky is wide, the heart is ready. This is the story of a boy who walked into the unknown, to become the one the unknown was waiting for. Join us in episode 2, as the next chapter unfolds. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the Worker channel. Each video is created as a sacred offering to inspire, to remember, and to walk the path together. You can support this journey simply by clicking like, sharing it with someone who may need it, or leaving a comment below. Every action helps spread Baba's light to corners still waiting to be reached. Thank you for being part of this unfolding prachar. Babanam Kevalam. Love is all there is.